All right, so it's our lesson 1 of COMP2084. So we're just kind of doing a bit of an introduction to ASP.NET. So we've thrown a few questions up on Blackboard. What'd you guys find out? I will kind of compile our answers here and save it on Blackboard for you. You're welcome. I'm doing your study notes for you today. So you need to take notes. So why learn ASP.NET? Why isn't this just PHP part 2?
Lower cost to run, usually just for hosting.
Yep, pretty easy to find inexpensive Windows hosting. You can usually find it as low as $5 or $10 a month. Find host to run it. Why else? What are some of the reasons to learn ASP.NET? Okay, and it's Lewis, right? Why is that important? So for performance, compiled code is always going to run faster than interpreted code. There's another big benefit of compiled code. Yeah, okay, so it's faster, smaller files. It can be, yes, because when you compile, you have to compile for a particular version of the .NET framework. And if the web server changes the version they're running of the framework, your code could be an issue. There's another big benefit of compiling our code in addition to performance. And right, can you explain that a bit more? Why is compiled code more secure?
Good guess on my part.
It was a very good guess. I was hoping somebody would say that.
Maybe because you're filing it code rather than just sending
It's not encrypted, but Nathaniel, your guess is again exactly right. Okay, so when we write a PHP application, right, when we deploy that application to the server, all our HTML and all our server-side code has to get deployed to the server, right? So it will include all our business logic, any credentials, encryption keys, all that stuff. So if the server gets hacked and someone has access to those PHP files, well, guess what? They have access to all the source code. With ASP.NET, we do have to still deploy our front-end codes, our HTML, Java's front-end, JavaScript, CSS, all that stuff has to go on the web server. But all the C# code we write gets compiled into DLL. So all we have to deploy to the server is the DLL. That basically is a binary version of all of our CS code, right? So if the server gets hacked, the hacker, they have this code, but it's compiled. They would have to figure out how to reverse engineer that DLL to convert it from binary back into all the original source. So it's way more secure. Now, this is also good for us as developers. In addition to being more secure, why is this good for us as developers from a business perspective? If we can just deploy our compiled code, where does the source code live in that case? Who has the source code? We do on our development machines. So if you build someone a PHP application today, you deploy it to the server, and tomorrow they decide, oh, we've hired somebody new who knows PHP, just send us the FTP credential and we don't need you anymore because we have someone who can modify the PHP site, right? They can do that. Well, intellectual property is a bit of a different question. I'm just looking at, that's maybe a conversation for another day. It's a good point, Stephen, but we're just talking about the practicalities. When you deploy a .NET site, right? Even if your client has access to the web server and access to the code, they don't have the source code. So if they want to update it, they want to change it, who do they have to get to do it? Us, the ones who maintain the source code. So oftentimes when you tell people we're going to build in a .NET environment, they'll say, well, what if I want the source code? Well, what happens if you buy software and you choose the option to get the software that includes the source code? Typically, what's the price of the source code version like? Usually 3 or 4 times the cost of software. So I've had clients ask before, well, what if I want the source code? Well, that's usually the conversation. Here's what it costs for me to build the application and you to use it. And it costs 3 times as much if you want the source code. We can do whatever you like. And invariably, they tend to choose the less expensive version. Okay? So it helps kind of protect us from a development perspective when we're writing compiled code. Okay? And the .NET framework was really the first web framework that allowed us to run compiled code on the web, on a web server. Before that, all web languages were interpreted scripting languages like PHP. That's actually where the name ASP comes from. It stands for Active Server Pages. And the original version of Microsoft's web pages, occasionally you'll see a really, really old website where the files have .asp extensions. So this was before .NET, pre-2002. When I started, my first applications were in ASP. So the server-side scripting language, we used VB-script. So very similar to PHP. And then in 2002, Microsoft said, hey, wait a minute, we figured out a way we can write compiled applications that will run on the web. And that's when .NET was created. So very important reasons. One of the huge, biggest benefits to using ASP.NET as opposed to using something like PHP. Anybody find any other reasons why we might want to know ASP.NET? There are tons and tons. In fact, when we create our first ASP.NET application before the end of class today, we're going to have about over 100 megs worth of support libraries added into that project automatically. We don't need them all, but there's a massive, almost anything you want to do, we can easily find a library or a package to hook into. So Microsoft has a package repository called NuGet where we can easily add packages into our projects. Any other reasons for learning .NET? There's a huge developer community, and unlike PHP, where PHP is free and it's open source, there's no commercial interest at stake. At the same time, the resources and documentation around PHP compared to what we get with .NET isn't great. So we have a huge resources, documentation, and developer community. Again, the first version of ASP.NET came out in 2002. So it's a mature product. It's been around for 16 years, right? So whatever we want to do, chances are someone's already done it. We can find a resource to help us.
Did you say that it communicates with the SQL server better?
Yeah, so it integrates. So SQL Server is one of the big three, basically 3 big enterprise level databases. We've got Oracle, we've got SQL Server, and we have DB2. That's like 90% of the enterprise database market. Each of those have roughly about a third share. I think Oracle's very slightly ahead of SQL Server in that game. But obviously, SQL Server is developed by Microsoft. It integrates really well with .NET applications, and the performance is really high. Anything else we may want to add to the list about why learn .NET? I'm going to give you one reason of my own. So let's compare, shall we? So this is jobs posted on this site in the last 30 days. 600 for PHP, that's not too bad. Any predictions what that number will be for .NET? Higher, lower, similar? That's pretty close. So almost 5 times the number of jobs. And keep in mind, for PHP developers, PHP is not that difficult to learn on your own if you have a little bit of technical knowledge, right? You don't need any special software. You don't really need to know how to program. You just need to learn the scripting language. Okay? This is much more difficult to learn, which means it's a big benefit to you in the job market for those of you who have the skills, right? There's fewer .NET developers out there and more demand, which is great for those of us who are planning on looking for work. Okay, so the job market, and also typically because .NET is used typically in enterprise environments. What does that mean for salaries? Right? You're getting, yeah, exactly. You're tending to get better pay as a .NET developer. So they're all good reasons to learn. So where do we go? We have this kind of rich repository of documentation. Where would you go? Right, so that's the Microsoft Developer Network. That's the official documentation. Right? So I want to use a class, or I want to know the methods or properties. I can go to the MSDN and look up that object, see the properties, methods, events, code samples on that. So that'd be one place to go. So that would be the official docs. Yeah. Yep. Where else? Right? Lynda has some great ASP.NET courses. Yeah, and you guys have free lynda.com subscriptions. Just use your Georgian login. Udemy. Sure, Stack Overflow. The other place that kind of actually I would recommend as the central hub, so I'm actually going to put it first, even ahead of the MSDN, is the official site, which is www.asp.net. Poke around here for a minute. So you can download straight from here. They update this community spotlight almost daily, telling you what's going on in the .NET world, new releases, new features, bug fixes, things like that. So that's always right here on the homepage. There's typically, I would say, 2 to 3 articles daily on here. And if you go in to learn, there is more stuff here than you possibly have time to go through. So if we look at, now there's sort of 2 versions. Well, there's 2 versions here. We'll talk about that. Within ASP.NET, they've got MVC and Web Forms. Web Forms is the initial version of ASP.NET that came out in 2002. And then probably around, I think, 2000, in Visual Studio 2008, as MVC became more and more popular, that programming pattern and software architecture, Microsoft decided they were going to introduce MVC to ASP.NET. So we basically had 2 flavors of .NET. You could do Web Forms, which was more traditional web development, although the code was still compiled, or you could do MVC. Web Forms has pretty much been deprecated. They still have resources here. They're not really updating it or promoting that anymore. So if we go in here for a minute, looking at websites with ASP.NET, there is so much here. So here's a getting started tutorial series with 11 tutorials. There's tons on here. There's video tutorials. This plural site course is actually really good, where they've got Microsoft professionals doing online video. They've got slides. They've got downloads. They've got sample exercises. Anything you might want to know how to do here. How do I deploy to Azure? Well, there's tutorials here. How do I manage user roles and permissions? How do I do mobile? How do I build an Angular front end with a .NET backend? Everything is here. So the MVC Music Store application that we're going to build in class, it's actually based on a tutorial. It's a little bit dusty and it's in here. Rather than follow that tutorial exactly, I've updated it for the current version of .NET because a lot of things are sort of out of date. The original tutorial I've actually left here. If you ever want to refer to it, it's in the tools and resources. I'll just show you that link. So here's the tutorial series. So believe it or not, this is actually 7 years old. So this is using like .NET 3, I think. We're now on 4.6, but it's got screenshots. It's got the whole shopping cart, but things like the online payment, that's not part of it. So I've added that in because I think that's a cool thing for us to know how to do. But they've screenshotted all the screens. Like our app is going to look kind of like this. It'll look a little nicer, but you kind of get the idea. You can actually see what we're going to be building here. It gives us all the code piece by piece, tells us how all this is put together. So I've kind of used this as a starting point. giving credit where credit is due, and I've modernized this for you. So this is a fantastic site and a great place to look. Somebody mentioned Stack Overflow. You'll probably have no problem getting your .NET questions answered on Stack Overflow. There is another option, which is within the .NET site itself, they have forums, and these forums are really good. I've used these forums lots over the years for solving problems when I couldn't solve, and they're also a little more organized than Stack Overflow. So, you know, I've got a problem related to integrating jQuery. Well, there's a specific subforum for that, where I can post a question, post a problem. Okay? All you need to do is use any Microsoft login to post here. They even have a point system, kind of like Stack Overflow. If you want to answer people's questions, you can. So deploying to Azure, there's lots of stuff here. Security, databases, and on and on and on, as well as general forums. So very useful. If you post on Stack Overflow and you're not getting a response, I suggest post it here as well. And there's a lot of Microsoft certified professionals who hang out in these forums and answer questions. Okay. I also find personally, I find people generally are a little more courteous on the official site than they are on Stack Overflow, where it's kind of a free-for-all. And you get a lot of really condescending people who treat you like you're an idiot because you don't know how to do something, which is sort of the whole point of being on the forum. If you knew how to do everything, you wouldn't be on there. I found there's a lot less of that on the official forum, probably because it's moderated by Microsoft. So I'll put that link on here. All right. Anybody worked with MVC before? Probably a few. Okay. What does it mean for starters? Model, view, controller. So for those of you who haven't worked with MVC before, this is the last 2 minutes of your life, you don't know what MVC means. From now on in 20 years, if I run into you on the street and say, what does MVC do? You'll easily be able to tell me. So what does the model, what does the view, what does the controller, what do these things mean? How'd you explain it? What's a model, or what does it do?
Is it the models your code on the back end?
Both of those are true, but it has a specific purpose. Because we'll have lots of back-end code, but the model does kind of only one thing. Vlad? It will be used for updates, yes. Anybody else want to take a stab explaining what our model classes do? Nope, that's one of the other layers. Well, that's all true. That's all true. Its specific purpose, our model classes represent our data. Not the data itself, it's separate from the database, but it's basically our application's representation of our data model. So for example, if we were building a social media application using an MVC framework, we would have model classes for things like profiles, posts, likes, shares. Right? Each model would represent based on a table in our database. So it's kind of a code representation as class files of the tables in our database. And yes, Vlad, that's what would then do call the updates, the inserts, right? So it's kind of based on our data. What about the views? The purpose of the view.
The person viewing sees user. Yeah.
Right. It's simply put UI. So in this course, those UI will be HTML pages, right? We're using a browser interface with the user. What other types of views could we have in an MVC application other than web pages? Okay, but what type of GUI? Could be, yep. Yep, so it could be a desktop GUI, right? So the back end can still follow the MVC pattern, but we have Windows screens. Absolutely, the GUI could be a mobile app. Right? So the back end of the application is still the same. And in fact, we can stick multiple views on the same application. Right? We have our models that represent the data. We have the controllers we'll talk about in a minute. And we may have a series of web views, and we may have a series of mobile views, and we may have a series of desktop views, all for the same application. So what about the controllers? What do they do? So all our logic lives here. So the controller is kind of like the brains, right? And it's really the interface in the model, the view. So we can change the view, and it shouldn't affect the controller or our model. So why bother with all this? Okay, can you explain a bit more, Virginia? Yep. Okay, so that also makes our code more maintainable, right? We can change what that view is, and we don't have to touch pieces on the back end. We want to change something in the GUI. Why else? Yeah, absolutely. Can you explain a bit more? Absolutely. So we can reuse both within an application as well as across applications, right? Because all our code is so modular. If we have a model or a controller in one application and we want to reuse that, we can simply plug that file in another application. Easy. Any other benefits of using this kind of pattern? Absolutely. How? Absolutely. Explain why, Steve?
No, I can't. I know what I mean, but I'm not sure I can explain it.
Okay. Here, well, let me show. Let's look at a PHP file for a minute. Let's.
You're going to know which section of the code. Start looking where it goes.
So let's look at how a PHP file now works. So in here, right, we've got some logic, we've got some UI, some HTML. We're talking to the database, basically using our model. So if we get an error in this file, it could be any one of these three things could be wrong. Logic could be wrong. We may have an issue with the database. We may have an issue with the UI. In an MVC pattern, this is broken out into three separate files, right? We have a model dealing with the data. We have a view doing the presentation. We have the controller in between. So if we get a database error, which file are we going to look in? The model, the view, or the controller? If we have a data error, we're going to look in the model, right? So that means 2/3 of the code we can ignore. We don't have to look through all of it to try and fix it. So it's way easier, as Steve said, to identify our errors. We can also unit test really easily. Our code is all modular. So in our MVC applications, regardless of what language we're using, we have many more files, but those files tend to be much smaller because every file has its own specific purpose, and each file is independent from any other file. They don't depend on each other, is the idea. What does this mean if we're working on a large project? That offers us another benefit. But we can work as a team, right? And maybe I'm going to work on the UI, and Barry's going to do the controllers, and Charlie's going to work on the models, right? We're not touching each other's files. It would be impossible to be able to write a file like this and divide the work and not be getting in each other's way and overwriting files. So the MVC pattern, it removes all that, so we can easily split the work up that way. So it has tons of benefits. So MVC is not, it's not part and parcel of .NET, as I said. It was added into .NET in 2008, even though .NET was created, ASP.NET was created in 2002. What are some of the other technologies that use the same architecture pattern? Yep, so what name one?
PHP, Java.
Yep, so it can use it in Java. In PHP, the most common is a framework called Laravel. Maybe some of you have used. Yep, so you guys will be doing that with Express and Node. You're on co-op in January. Next summer, you take advanced web programming. You're going to build MVC applications where it's JavaScript through the whole stack. JavaScript on the back end, JavaScript for the database, JavaScript on the front end as well. But it will still use the same architecture. There still has to be some sort of framework. Most languages will have some sort of framework for it. I don't know.
The only language I can think of that isn't going to use MVC is Python. It's not object-oriented.
Right. The actual, now nobody's actually named the first really popular MVC platform. Nope. The first platform that actually made MVC popular was Ruby. That was like the godfather of, that was the first really kind of widely used MVC platform. So then other languages have then since adopted. So the good news is once you understand the pattern and the architecture, it's like it wouldn't be very hard for you guys at the end of this course to go and learn Ruby. This is to learn the syntax. But the way your application is structured and how the different components talk to each other, that's going to be the same, no matter which one of those technologies. Same with, right now I've got a student working on a project through the Research and Innovation Center. He's using PHP, but he's using the Laravel framework. If I showed you the code for that, the code structure is going to look really similar to what we're doing in here. So by also doing MVC in this class, it'll make your Node and Express class next summer that much easier, because we're already following the same kind of pattern and rules. So the new .NET technology that's platform independent, what's that one called? You got it. So it's called .NET Core. I want to talk about this for a minute. Go back to the Learn page. So you notice as soon as we get here, Microsoft says, hey, do you want to learn regular .NET or do you want to learn .NET Core? So we'll talk a bit about the differences. So .NET MVC, as I said, is more mature. It's been around. It's in its 11th year now, I believe. .NET Core came out, I think, in 2015, so it's newer. The .NET Core has some benefits. So it is completely platform independent. So it will run, or you can write it on OS X or Linux. It's also designed to be faster. So typically, if you built the same application with .NET MVC or .NET Core, the .NET Core version should run faster. Now, why are we are going to do a couple weeks of .NET Core, but why are we going to use kind of the more traditional version for now? That really just has to do with the job market. Because .NET Core is so new, there's still not a lot of companies and organizations out there that have doing a lot of development in .NET Core. Okay? And when I looked, I started going through a lot of these listings, and I always check at the beginning of every semester. I keep checking, am I seeing lots of .NET Core in the .NET developer jobs? And the answer is not yet. I'd still say if you start looking through these listings, maybe about 1 in 5 is going to say .NET Core. So if we only did .NET Core, My concern is you're going to go out in the workplace, get a job doing .NET development, and the technology you're working with is .NET MVC. Now, Core still uses the MVC pattern, but for that reason, I've decided we're going to mostly focus on .NET Core, and we'll still on .NET MVC. We'll do a little bit of .NET Core at the end of the semester. So at least you've had some exposure to it. You can still put it on your resume. You'll have a little application with .NET Core you can show that you've built. Okay, so we'll do both, and probably as this course evolves over time, that balance is going to switch. We'll mostly do Core, and we'll maybe do a little bit of more traditional MVC. No, there isn't. The way I would describe the biggest change, I guess there's a couple of changes. One is a lot of the GUI tools and automated things that .NET MVC gives us, they've removed from Core. The other thing is in terms of structure, Core looks a little bit more like Node and Express application. So we're doing more things like from a command line, etc. But they both still follow an MVC pattern. And in fact, one of the good things on here, you can actually see if you want to see it, is some of the tutorials on this site, they give you both versions. So you can actually toggle between, here's the MVC version and here's the Core version. So you could look through and you can actually kind of see side by side how they're different. So for example, in like one simple example is our site configuration file in MVC, it's in XML format with a .config extension. In Core, it's a JSON file, like it would be in a Node and Express application. So we will get a chance to play with that stuff a little bit, though, for a couple of weeks before the end of the term. All right, so I'll save those little notes. Probably be a few questions on the midterm that come out of this. But it's open books. You can always go into week one and look up the answer. Okay. So, I mean, Microsoft's moving in the direction of open source by finally allowing developers on other platforms to run their applications and even to develop on other platforms. That took a long time. And even they've made the community edition available. Now, I don't really know, actually, if somebody can check. I'm curious what the enterprise version of Visual Studio actually costs. I'm not sure. Does it cost you guys anything as Georgian students? I don't know if you went on Amazon and looked it up, what Visual Studio 2017 Enterprise would cost. If I had to guess, I'd say probably somewhere, I'd say maybe, I don't know, $800–900 would be my guess. I don't really know. I remember buying the first version of Visual Studio.NET in 2002. I bought the professional, not the enterprise edition. Anybody want to guess what that cost? $1,200? $1,000? Was $1,700 US, so it was about $2,200 Canadian. So the barrier to entry for .NET developers has traditionally been very high. You had to really want to be a .NET developer when you could open Notepad and create a PHP application for free. 3,000. Yeah. So it's a pretty nice deal you guys get as an Imagine student with that license. The last question I asked you, we'll take a break shortly. I'll just make this available. For the visual learners in the room, this is kind of what MVC looks like. So I just want to spend a couple minutes talking about how this actually works in practice, right? So here are three components. So you notice the view and the model, they don't talk to each other directly, right? The view and the model always interface through the controller. All the messages have to go through here. So we've got our client, which could be anything, could be a desktop browser, a mobile, could be desktop, mobile, anything, web. And we've got this dispatcher. So the dispatcher is basically our web server that interprets incoming requests and decides what to do. So here's what a typical .NET request might look like. One of the nice things about MVC is typically all MVC frameworks, not just .NET, typically they come with descriptive URLs. So we can simply look at the address of a page and we're going to have a pretty good idea of exactly what's supposed to happen on that page. So let me explain how this works kind of in conjunction with that diagram. Yes, we want to use HTTPS. We'll get to that later in the term. Plain old HTTP is gone. Here's what a typical URL might look like. Doesn't matter if it's .NET, if it's Node, if it's Ruby. If it follows an MVC pattern, we might see URLs like this. Right? So a user clicks on a link or types this address into their address bar. Right? So that URL goes to the server. We can pretty much, everybody in this room can probably infer what's supposed to happen at this URL. What is the user expecting to see when they go to that URL? Yeah, the product details about product with the ID 123. So here's how this works in .NET MVC environment. The URL comes in automatically. The server, the MVC interpreter, the first thing it's going to do is it's going to go to this file. Got a subfolder, which Visual Studio is automatically going to build for us, called controllers. And in there, it's going to look for a file. It basically takes that name and looks for a controller with that exact name with the word controller on the end of it. Within here, it's then going to look for a method called details. What's the signature of that method going to look like? Is it going to have any parameters? Yeah, how many parameters is it going to have? How many pieces of information does this method need to run? One. What data type is that going to need? Yep. So this URL looks for this file. In this file, it looks for a method with that name, and it expects that method is going to accept one parameter of type integer. So our controller method is then going to look for this file. Going to look for models. And that model is going to take that ID of 123, go and query our SQL server or whatever type of database it is. It's probably going to be SQL server. And our model is going to fetch that as a strongly typed object. Right? So it's got all of the properties, data types, validation rules that we have for a product. It'll hand back that product object to the controller. Our controller is then going to look for a view, going to look for this file. That's going to be the extension for all our views in .NET MVC, CS/HTML. And this view is actually going to accept a strongly typed object. So that object will inherit all the properties and methods of a product. Okay? We're not just handing back a bunch of text data like we do in PHP. It's actually an object that this view has, and then the view can render the product to the user, right? With all of the properties we can reference, like the name, the price, the description, etc., manufacturer, whatever else is there. So we follow this same pattern every time. So most of our controllers, we're going to have methods like details, add, edit, delete. And in fact, later on, we're going to get Visual Studio to automatically write all of those methods for us, which is awesome. This was part of the goal when Microsoft created ASP.NET. Is they said, what are the things that web developers are spending time repeatedly doing over and over and over again? Like connecting to databases, writing login scripts, building navigation bars, adding CSS, rendering lists. And can't we just automate all that stuff? So you could just focus on your application logic rather than doing all these repetitive tasks again and again. That was kind of the whole idea when they created Visual Studio in 2002. Right? Was we'll let Visual Studio, it's powerful, it'll do a lot for us. Right? We just have to understand enough about how to use the tool. So all of our requests, they're pretty much all going to look like this in here. Okay? So once we understand the MVC pattern and architecture, this gets really repetitive and familiar, which means it's easy to work with. All right. Any questions before we take a break? Clear so far? Okay, let's take 10 minutes. When we come back, we'll actually fire up Visual Studio. We'll build one of these 130 megabyte projects and we'll see what's in there.